Good morning. My name is Helene Berman. I'm the Associate Dean Research in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Western here in London and the Academic Director of the Center for Research on Health Equity and Social Inclusion. And it's my great privilege to introduce this morning's plenary speaker, Kate Pickett. Dr. Pickett comes to us from the University of York in the United Kingdom, not to be confused with York University down the road, where she is a professor of epidemiology. She has a varied background, having studied biological anthropology at Cambridge, nutritional sciences at Cornell, and epidemiology at Berkeley, and taught for 4 years at the University of Chicago. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and is a co-founder of the Equality Trust, an organization that is working to improve the quality of life in the United Kingdom by reducing income inequality. Dr. Pickett has received numerous awards and recognitions for her contributions, some of which are listed in the program bio. But I'm sure that many of you are most familiar with Kate as co-author with Richard Wilkinson of The Spirit Level: Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better. In wonderful detail, the authors use data from varied sources, including the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and the US Census, to illustrate convincingly and compellingly that social inequality is bad for our health and that it harms everyone, not only those living in poverty. The life-diminishing results of valuing growth over equality in wealthy societies can be seen all around us. Inequality causes shorter, unhealthier, and unhappier lives. It increases the rates of teen pregnancy, violence, obesity, imprisonment, and addictions. It destroys relationships between individuals born in the same society, but into different socioeconomic groups. And its function as a driver of consumption continues to deplete our planet's resources. So eliminating income inequality can't be seen as an option. We have to do it, and it's a challenge that's even more imperative in the context of today's contemporary world events. And we need to recognize that income inequality is not a problem that exists elsewhere, but is very much a reality in Canada, in Ontario, and right here in London. Coming to the conclusion that we have to eliminate income inequality isn't something that requires an ideological leap. There are many parts of the world that are already leading the way. So either we go down the road of inequality and declining health, or we go down the road of equality. As Kate will share with us, I think, if we value our individual and collective health, there really is no choice. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and we're thrilled to have you here with us. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Kate Pickett.
Thank you very much, Helene, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here to Ontario to talk to you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I thought quite hard about what to talk to you about because I know that this conference is all about action and change. So I'm not just going to give you a sort of academic lecture showing you all the relationships. I really want to talk about how evidence informs what we do. But I wanted to start with this slide. It's an executive under stress. And I've put him up there because 40 years ago, people thought that people like this were the most likely to have heart disease, to have a heart attack. They thought that executive stress was the cause of cardiovascular disease. And if you are at the top of an organization, you must be very stressed. It's a stressful position, so those people will have more heart attacks. Doctors thought that, people on the street thought that, the executives sitting behind the desk thought that. Everybody thought that. Some people still think it. You can buy this on Amazon. It's executive stress formula, a food supplement with vitamin, mineral, and herbs. Problem is, there's no such thing as executive stress, and they weren't the ones having the heart attack. We'd got it completely wrong, but it's a very persistent myth. In fact, it's people at the bottom of society with lowest incomes, least education, who have more cardiovascular disease. And studies have shown that again and again. In fact, if we look within a society, here's life expectancy. This is England and Wales, small areas. We see quite a huge gap in health between the top and the bottom. Can you hear me if I move away from the microphone? So in the most deprived areas, England and Wales, these data are a little bit old, but the patterns stay the same. Life expectancy of 71.5 years. Okay, the poorest areas. But if you live in the richest areas, almost 80 years. So that's the big gap between the health of the people at the top and the health of the people at the bottom. So that's the scale of health inequality. But what's also so interesting is that we have this gradient. So it isn't just a question of being poor, and there's something about being poor that makes you poorly. Even if you live in the second 20th most affluent areas, your life expectancy is a little bit lower than those at the very top. So not only do we not have executive strength, but we have this sort of finely tuned gradient right across societies, where some people's lives are cut short simply because they are nearer the bottom of society and other people live longer. It's as if we imposed a little sort of death sentence on people who are poorer than us. Now, these social gradients are ubiquitous, they're everywhere. They're present for almost all kinds of illnesses, all causes of death. This is Canada, 1991 to 2001, a social gradient in life expectancy and in health-adjusted life expectancy. So everywhere we look, if we look in Canada, if we look in poor countries, middle-income countries, if we look at men, if we look at women, if we look by education or by social class, we see these patterns. And sometimes we see them most starkly when we look at geography. And I wanted to show you this one because this is an excellent use of data and an excellent presentation of getting your facts across. This is exactly the same picture, social gap in life expectancy, but it's shown on the London Underground map. Some of you may be familiar with this, it's quite well known. So if you start out in Westminster, we're going on the Jubilee line. Westminster's quite posh. Okay, if you start in Westminster, male life expectancy there is 77.7 years. Now, if you go along the east and you end up in Canning Town, male life expectancy has dropped to 71.6. So you lose a year of life expectancy for every stop that you travel along the Jubilee line. I've seen this for the New York subway as well. I've seen it for local towns in Britain do it with their bus routes, showing that as you go in towards the centre of town, life expectancy drops, and then as you drive out again, it increases. Really useful graphic ways of showing the difference. And here's another really shocking one. Here's life expectancy for men, again. This is Colton. It's an area of Glasgow, in Scotland, in the UK. And in Colton, male life expectancy is 54 years. This is Lenzie. It's also in Glasgow, in Scotland, and life expectancy there is 82. Here's Washington, D.C., the African American population in Washington, D.C., 63 years, and down the road in Montgomery County, white population, 80. So we're just going across town and seeing these stark differences. Men in India have a higher life expectancy than men in Colton, Glasgow. Despite the fact that in India many people are living in absolute poverty, very few people in Colton, in Glasgow, are living in absolute poverty, although many are living in relative poverty. But these huge differences, you really would think that we would try to do something about them, wouldn't you? It's nothing to do with how rich a country is. So looking at life expectancy again here, going from about 75 up to 80 years on the side, and we're just looking at the rich, developed, market economies here. You can be a really rich country and have pretty abysmal life expectancy if you're the USA. Look at them in comparison to Norway. You can be a somewhat poorer country, Israel, Greece, and do much better in terms of life expectancy than Portugal, which is equally poor. So it's nothing to do with how wealthy a society is, and I can tell you it's got absolutely nothing to do with how much a country spends on healthcare. The USA spends more on healthcare than any country in the world, and it comes bottom of the league table for health in rich nations. But what is related to health and many other social problems is the scale of inequality in a society. So it's not how rich a society is, it's how big the gap is between those at the top and those at the bottom. So Richard Wilkinson and I created an index of health and social problems. You can see them listed up the side there. If you're doing well on this index, you're at the bottom. If you're doing poorly, you're near the top. And we've got a measure of income inequality across the bottom. So in Japan, Norway, Sweden, Finland, low levels of income inequality, and they do very well on this index of health and social problems. If you're a more unequal society, here we've got New Zealand, UK, Portugal, the USA, much more inequality, much higher rate of problems. So you'd think if you saw this, you might want to do something about it. But the trouble is that we don't look at the evidence, we don't listen to it, or we don't believe what it tells us, or we fail to grapple with what it is we need to do to change things. In the European Union, the presidency of the EU rotates every year. And the UK held the presidency of the UK in 2006. Sadly, they will never hold it again. But when Tony Blair was president of the EU for that year, he chose to focus on inequalities in health. He said that was one of the things he wanted a focus on. And so he commissioned a professor at Erasmus University in the Netherlands, Johan Mackenbach, to look at health inequalities across Europe, come up with recommendations, see what good practice there was. And what Johan Mackenbach said was, well, the UK have got the best research on health inequalities. They've got a long tradition of it. They do it really, really well. They've got more government white papers and policy papers on what to do about health inequalities. And they've got more health inequalities stuff written into their clinical practice, their public health guidance, etc., than any other country. And it hasn't made the slightest difference. If anything, health inequalities are growing. I went the wrong way there. We've known this since 1980. So the Black Report was the world's first government-commissioned report on health inequalities. It was set up after Richard Wilkinson, my co-author, wrote a letter to the Secretary of State, a public letter published in newspapers setting out the shocking health inequalities he was aware of. So the government at the time, the Labour government, set up a commission to look at inequalities in health. It's called the Black Report. It was commissioned in 1977, I think, but it didn't come out until 1990. And by then we'd had a change of government. So we no longer had the Labour government that had commissioned this report. We had Margaret Thatcher. So they didn't like the Black Report, and they got a minister to write something in the front of it saying they didn't really believe it. And anyway, they weren't going to do anything about it. They weren't going to spend money on reducing health inequalities. And they published it on Bank Holiday Monday, an August public holiday, in the hope that nobody would notice. And they only published, I think it was 160 copies on sort of cheap paper. We've got 2 of these at home. They're sort of epidemiological gold, really, to have one of these original reports. There were so few of them. But when you try to bury something, sometimes it gets out anyway. And health inequalities became known. So most people in England who work in health and most of the public would no longer make the mistake of thinking that health is worse at the top than at the bottom. We had another report in the 1990s from Sir Donald Aitchison. It showed the same thing. We had another report in 2010 from Sir Michael Marmot. It showed the same thing. The health inequalities haven't changed. The recommendations about what to do about it haven't changed, and yet health inequalities are still growing. It's because we focus on the wrong thing. It's called lifestyle drift in my discipline. This is a model of the social determinants of health that we all think, is a reasonable approximation to what is going on. And it's the socioeconomic and political context that determines the health of a population. But the reason why all of our UK health inequalities related policy and practice has failed to make any difference is because it concentrates on changing people's behaviours. Lifestyle drift is this tendency to focus on the downstream factors. We try to get people to stop smoking, we try to get people to eat more healthily, we would like them to have some exercise, but we don't want to do anything about poverty and inequality and joblessness and all of the other broader social determinants of health. And so we make no difference. Because if you manage to get somebody to stop smoking today, there's a kid behind the bike sheds having his first cigarette at school, age 9. So if you don't change the structures that continually reproduce the poor health, you will have to keep trying to do this forever. It's a band-aid at best and not a very good one. And yet we still go on sort of being surprised to find that these health inequalities exist. This year, so 2017, so decades after that Black Report came out, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health produced a report on child health in Britain. The Guardian, which is, an excellent newspaper, tends to do a good job of reporting on the news, called this a landmark report. Stark inequalities, high rates of child death, etc. A landmark report. So in what sense was it a landmark? The risk of an infant dying in the bottom social class compared to the top is twofold. You're twice as likely to have a baby die if you're in the bottom social class as if you were in the top. That's exactly the same as in the Black Report in 1980. It hasn't altered one iota. It isn't news. This isn't a landmark report. This is more of the same. This report also said that British children aren't doing so well compared to children in other rich countries in Europe, for instance, that our children are less healthy, less happy. That's not new either. We've known this one since 2007. So we've known this for a decade. UNICEF produces an index of child well-being in rich countries, and here we're plotting it against a measure of income inequality, just as we did with our index of health and social problems. The more equal countries over here on the left, higher levels of child well-being, and the more unequal countries at this end doing worst. We came bottom in that one. The UK had the worst child well-being in rich countries in 2007. You'd think that would galvanise the politicians and the policymakers to do something, but when they saw that, they said, the data are old. Well, you all know, data are always old, okay? They're always old, because you have to collect them, you have to clean them, you have to analyse them, you have to publish them. Data are always old. They weren't that old. We'll be doing better next time, they said. We didn't come bottom in the next one because they'd added some poorer countries like Romania and Malta, but we're still lagging very much behind. They said, those are just statistics anyway. Those don't tell you what life is like or what the concerns of families in the UK might be. They're just statistics. So UNICEF UK said, all right, we'll go and do some qualitative work with families in Sweden, in Spain, and in the UK. They did ethnographic work with families. They met with groups of children in their schools. They tried to understand the lives of children in a very equal society, a very unequal society, and one that was somewhere in the middle. And what they found was that UK families' lives were being destroyed by inequality and materialism. And when they published that report, guess what they said? There's no statistics. Absolutely right, Vandana. You cannot win. They're just stories. Those are just stories. So the message really is you do need both. You absolutely need your statistics, but you absolutely need your stories as well. Unfortunately, it still may not make a difference. Last year, we published a review of all of the literature on income inequality and health, putting it into a causal framework. There are over 300 studies showing that greater inequality leads to worse population health. They are robust, they are excellent evidence of a causal relationship, and still we do nothing. Now, some people have argued in the past, and sadly often argued with me, I don't like confrontation, but sometimes you have to do it, that we need some inequality, okay? That if you don't have some degree of differentiation in a society, you won't have economic growth. They think you've got to have some inequality if you're going to have economic growth. They think you've got to have some inequality if people are going to have aspirations. Because unless there's something to strive for, they won't try very hard. So we won't be innovative, we won't be creative. There are reasons for needing some inequality. Well, that's another set of myths that are wrong. And when you're arguing, it's always good to have a Nobel Prize-winning economist on your side. Joe Stiglitz says inequality is bad for business, it's bad for the economy, it's bad for democracy, it's bad for societies, it's a choice, it's not an economic necessity. And we're getting more and more economists pointing out that there is no link between greater inequality and economic growth. It's bad for growth. It gets in the way of poverty reduction, and it causes economic instability, recessions, booms and busts. So there's no good economic reason for wanting to tolerate a certain degree of inequality. And it's bad for the environment too. Here we've got kilograms of CO2 emissions per $100 of income. More unequal countries emit more CO2 per capita. They do badly on a whole range of environmental things. They recycle less, more unequal societies. Have I got the bicycles one? Yeah, this is the one I'm fond of. People take more trips by bicycle in more equal societies. Business leaders are more likely to say that they think their government should comply with international environmental regulation in more equal societies. And one that surprised me is that actually inequality is related to biodiversity. You get more biodiversity in more equal societies, probably because the most unequal societies tend to have mono-agriculture, plantation farming, single crops on big areas of land, and reduced biodiversity. A colleague of mine, Danny Dorling, has produced a series of charts like this. This one's looking at water consumption in relation to inequality. He's also done it for meat. He's done it for flights. He's done it for all sorts of things. If you check out his website, there's lots and lots of interesting visual stuff for you to borrow. And lastly, if we think about innovation and we look at patents per capita, which is a reasonable measure of how creative a society is, you do better if you're a more equal society. So this idea of innovation, this idea of economic growth, all needing some inequality, it's all wrong. It's all wrong. Inequality has no redeeming features. It's just sort of bad all the way through. It's bad for health, it's bad for our relationships with one another, it's bad for the planet, it's bad for the economy. And there's less social mobility in more unequal societies. This is another thing where politicians across the spectrum will say, oh, we're not that interested in equality of outcomes, like incomes. We want there to be equality of opportunity. You know, everybody to have the same chance in life. You can't have one without the other. You can't have equality of opportunity in a vastly unequal society. Children's life chances are trammelled by inequality. Their parents are more likely to have mental health or other physical health problems. They're more likely to live in families where there is drug abuse. There is more child maltreatment in more unequal societies. More kids drop out of school. So from birth onwards, living in a more unequal society is a bit like having a ball and chain around your foot. A colleague of mine who lives here and works here in Canada showed with international data set that children start to show the impact of living in an unequal society by about the age of 5. So we sometimes joke that if you want to live the American dream, you should go to Denmark. He says, well, as long as you get your kids to Denmark before they turn 5, they'll be all right, but after that, they will start to show some signs of damage. So here's the long list of all the things that the literature suggests are made worse when societies become more unequal. Lots of measures of physical health, increasingly a long list of psychological problems and mental illness. But it's bad for things like cultural participation. It's bad for civic participation. People in more unequal societies are less likely to vote. They're less likely to go to a museum or an art gallery or a conference. They're more likely to be violent, etc. And then children's life chances, as I spoke about. So if you've got all of that, what else do you need to make things change? If you've got the evidence, what else do you need? Well, you need a mandate, don't you? If you want political change, people have got to want it. The thing is, they do. In Britain, we have something called the British Social Attitude Survey. It runs every year, and random samples of the population are asked about their attitudes to things, and it gets reported on every year. And for a long time, they have asked people in this survey, how much do you think the chairman of a large national company should earn? How much do you think an unskilled factory worker should earn? They give them various jobs and they ask them what do they think people should earn. And what people think is that the chairman of the large national company should get 6.25 times what the unskilled factory worker gets. That's what people think. It's crept up a bit over the years as Britain has become more and more unequal. Our toleration of inequality has increased a bit, but not much. The ratio of what they actually get is 16-1. And in our top companies, on the Financial Times Stock Exchange list, it's 300-1. In America, at times, it's been over 400-1 in large companies. 80% of the British public think that income differences are too large. It's massive. If that's not a mandate, I don't know what is. Unfortunately, they don't know what they want done about it, but they do think something should be done about it. And Americans are just the same. Michael Norton and Dan Ariely, Harvard and Duke universities, did an online survey of Americans, and what they did was that they showed them distributions of wealth. They asked them to say what they thought the distribution of wealth is in America and what they would like it to be. You know, they got to pick one that they preferred. So the top bar is the actual distribution of wealth. We're talking about wealth here, not income. So what are we up to? over 80%. The top fifth, the top 20% have over 80% of the wealth. Americans think they've only got 60%. They haven't, they've got 80%. The distribution of income that Americans picked as what they would prefer was this one, where the top 20% would only have about 30%. What they didn't know is that this is Sweden. 92% of Americans picked Sweden as the income distribution they would like. And it made no difference if they were Democrat or Republican, African American, Hispanic or white, male or female, educated or not. They all wanted Sweden. And if that's not a mandate, I don't know what is. What would we have to do? To reduce income inequalities, you can do it in two ways. You can either reduce income differences before tax, or you can use taxes and a benefit system, a welfare system, to redistribute wealth. So if you can stop people avoiding tax, if you can end tax havens, and if you can make taxation more progressive again, you will reduce inequality. The trouble with this strategy is that as soon as a new government comes in, they can change it. So under our last Labour government, the top tax rate went up from 40% to 50%, and nobody murmured. And then we had a new government, and they dropped it back to 40% again. So fiscal policy is vulnerable to political tides and change. If you can decrease income differences before tax through things like economic democracy, and I'll talk about that a little more in a second, we believe that you could probably get greater equality more deeply embedded in the culture of work. And the reason that we think it doesn't matter which approach you take is because if we look at the international comparisons, Sweden and Japan do equally well on our index of health and social problems, but Sweden gets its greater equality through redistribution, taxes and benefits, and Japan does it by having smaller income differences before tax. And if we look at the United States, Vermont and New Hampshire, which are very similar in lots of ways and right next door to each other, both pretty equal for US states. Vermont gets its greater equality through welfare systems, social security and taxes. New Hampshire, it's more like Japan. What I mean by economic democracy is anything that brings a bit of democracy into the workplace. So it could be things like putting employee representatives on company boards, particularly on the remuneration committees that set the salaries. It could be strengthening trade unions. It could be different kinds of companies, cooperatives, mutuals, employee-owned companies, employee share ownership schemes. And what it does is it turns companies from being a piece of property into a community, because everybody has a stake and everybody is engaged. It redistributes wealth, particularly unearned income, shareholder income. It improves productivity, and it just has lots and lots of positive things. And it's quite easy to think about how this would happen. Who here is employed? Who's got a job? Right. Think about your salary. Think about your boss's salary, your ultimate boss. How much more would you let them have than you? So for me, working at the University of York, I think I have quite a nice salary. I might let the Vice-Chancellor have 1.5 times mine. I don't want to do some of the things he has to do. But I wouldn't let him have more than that. And if we compared his salary to the cleaning staff and the catering staff, maybe we'd all sit around and we'd go, well, 20 to 1, but we wouldn't say 300. So anytime you get people discussing these things, anytime there's some transparency and some openness and some discussion, then our human common sense comes shining through, and we tend to do a lot better. So anything that increases democracy and democratic processes is going to help reduce income differences. You can see it beautifully if you look at this graph of changes in trade union strength in relation to income inequality over the 20th century. So we're going from 1918 here up to 2008, and the red line is income inequality and the grey line is union membership. And it's sort of like a photographic negative. So as trade union power waxes and wanes, inequality increases and decreases. This isn't because of what trade unions do around pay negotiations, really. It's a signal of the strength of a progressive movement in society when you have strong trade unions. So, stronger legislation for employee representation on company boards is really needed. Our current Prime Minister in the UK, Theresa May, stood on the steps of 10 Downing Street when she wasn't elected, when she was just about to take up her premiership, and she said, we are going to put employees on company boards. And then she changed her mind. What are they frightened of, do you think? It's quite astonishing, isn't it? When I was at school, secondary school, I sat on the governing body as the student representative. And at the university, we have students on all our boards. Why are they so frightened of employers? We could be incentivizing employee buyouts, we could give tax concessions for democratic businesses, but we can do things too. We need to take our business to the companies that are more democratic. What we need is something like a fair trade logo that shows which companies are more democratic, because then we could take our business to them. There's a lot more than you would think, but some of these are British, some of these are American, but you know, if you know these things, then you can go and buy Divine chocolate instead of Hershey's or something. You can have the phone co-op instead of AT&T. I was stopped in the supermarket the other day by a man trying to sell me a new phone plan. And I said, no, I don't want it, thank you. And he said, can I ask why not? And I said, well, I'm with the phone co-op. And he said, what's that? And I told him, and he said, well, that's a good idea. So, you know, you can spread the word. We need to get these things better known. But it does feel like an uphill struggle. It's really hard to have an impact on these big problems. We set up the Equality Trust in 2009 to campaign for greater equality and to educate. It's a charity, now a registered charity. We publish a guide on what activists can do to fight inequality. It's a free download, so please do visit the Equality Trust website if you're interested. So we do our campaigning. We have local groups all over the UK. They campaign locally. You know, they write to their MPs. They hold hustings at elections. They ask potential politicians to sign up to pledges. But we're really struggling to make any impact at all at national government level. We wrote our book, Richard and I, to try and campaign, to try and get that word out, because nobody reads academic research. Nobody. I mean, not even your mum. I once read a paper by someone who I thought had got something badly wrong, and I thought, I'm going to write a rebuttal of that. And then I looked it up, and nobody had ever cited that paper. So I didn't bother, because nobody reads them. Right? So we've been writing academic papers for donkey's years, nobody reads them. So we thought we'd write a book that people would read. And it hasn't sold that badly, actually, for a serious work of non-fiction. It's been translated now into 25 languages. But really, not many people have read it. Some people would like to have read it and haven't read it. Richard always says, if someone asks you if you've read something which you think you should have read and you haven't read it, you should just say, not personally. So more people may own it. The Guardian newspaper did us proud. When our book came out, this is what The Guardian did across 2 pages. You know, this full spread with so much better graphs than I could ever draw, you know, and exciting contrasts made. So people do read newspapers, but not that many people. Most people in the UK do not read The Guardian. You know, being labelled a Guardian reader, it's an insult. It means you're a lefty. You know, you're sort of do-gooder, middle-class lefty if you're a Guardian reader. Most people read The Sun or the Daily Mail, the tabloid press. They don't get this stuff. So we've tried other things too. Someone's made a film inspired by our book. It's called The Divide. You can get it on Netflix now. It had great reception in Britain. It uses stories more than statistics. It tells the stories of several people's lives in the UK and the USA, illustrating the impact that inequality has had on them. So, you know, this is going out in cinemas and audiences are sitting there watching it. But still, not that many people. When you think of the kind of grassroots mass movement that we need to change things. Someone made a play about us as well. A theatre group from Sweden got together with a theatre group from Morocco and they did a joint production of a play, which I found very moving, and Richard said he couldn't understand. So different things appeal to different people. When we first set up the Equality Trust, someone said to us, oh, you should have some poetry on there. And I said, no, I'm poetry. We're going to have statistics, we're going to have evidence, we're going to have facts. I've completely changed my mind. I was completely wrong. Poetry reaches parts that other things don't, right? Theatre reaches some people. Film reaches other people. Books reach some people. TED Talks reach a lot of people. That's probably our biggest impact, actually. A TED Talk seen by over 2.5 million people. But even that's still a drop in the ocean, isn't it? So you have to use every method you can. We keep on writing. This is our most recent little book for the Fabian Society, free download again on the links between inequality. Co-sponsored by a German think tank. They keep inviting us over. We go, we speak all over the world. Are we having an impact? One thing that's happened since we wrote The Spirit Level, and it started as a movement inspired by the book, was the establishment of fairness commissions in local authorities in England. There's now been about 16 of them. And these are where the local authority sets up a commission to look at what it can do to reduce inequality in its local area. They've really differed in their composition, in their remit. I sat on the York one, Richard chaired one in London, but they've happened all over the place. And they have been quite successful. Local authorities have limited powers as to what they can do to reduce inequality, but they do have some power. Every single local authority that has had a fairness commission has become a living wage employer. And my local council, City of York, not only pays all of its staff the living wage, it requires every company with whom it procures or contracts to do the same. So that's how you start to spread good practice in a locality. So fairness commissions have been very important. We had a living wage commission too, and we have a big living wage movement. We were all extremely annoyed when our Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, George Osborne, announced that he was going to be paying a living wage to everybody. But it wasn't. It was just a little raise in the minimum wage. A living wage is established by experts to be the amount of money which a person or family needs to live reasonably in society. And in my mind, if you pay anybody less than a living wage, you are exploiting them. You are exploiting their labour. Oxfam's been campaigning like nobody's business. This, a few years ago, came out with a statistic that the 85 richest people on the planet own the same wealth as the 3.5 billion. They've always campaigned on poverty in the past. Now they've got a 10-year campaign on inequality. And Vandana and I were discussing earlier that the number is now down to 6. The Occupy movement was useful too. It really showed that you can capture imaginations, you can get people on the street, you can get a lot of media attention. Unfortunately, they didn't really know what they wanted. So, you need your mass movement, you need your grassroots, but you need to know what it is you're fighting for. We've also now got an international framework for thinking about reducing inequality. The Sustainable Development Goals, although they're a bit bonkers and a bit wonky, they're fabulous at the same time, because it's the first time we've had an international framework of what development should look like for both rich, poor, and middle-income countries, signed up to by all 193 nations that belong to the UN, and they've all agreed to do this by 2030. They won't, but they've said they will, and it gives us a framework for monitoring them and pressuring them. Goal number 10 is reducing inequalities. So we have a framework for doing things, but we keep on just doing the same old stuff. And it's strange, really, because many of the problems we're suffering in the world today, globalization, inequalities, environmental degradation, health and social problems, they've all actually come about because we had neoliberal economics thrust upon us by ideologues who believed that that was the way that you created economic growth and prosperity. And they did believe it. So if you were Ronald Reagan in 1980 or Mrs. Thatcher at the same time, you could actually believe that you were doing the right thing because you were being advised by economic experts that this was the way to bring prosperity to your country, to your population. You could believe that. You can't now, but we still keep on doing it. We've got evidence that it doesn't work now, but we still keep on doing it. Quite like this cartoon. They say a rising tide lifts all boats. Do they say when? This is what we were promised, to trickle down economics that we would all benefit, but it didn't happen. So almost the last slide. It's always good to end with Cicero, I feel. I don't have the benefit of a classical education, but I can pretend I do. He says, any man can make mistakes, but only an idiot persists in his error. And this is what it feels like we're doing. We are persisting in our error. We are persisting in our toleration of gross inequalities that destroy our societies, that cause untold amounts of suffering, and we just go on thinking it's too big a problem to tackle. So I hope that what you're all here for this weekend is to help figure out how we do it. I'll keep doing my research, and I'll keep writing books, and when I can, I'll come and give talks, and I'll write blogs and things for newspapers when I can, and if somebody wants to make a poem about it, I'll be really happy. But I'm just one person, and we do need vast numbers of people rising up and acting in solidarity to change this. Look at the feminist movement, look at the civil rights movement, look at gay rights, and see how much progress can be achieved in a short period of time if enough people want it. We didn't see those changes because somebody in power decided to hand out some rights to people. We saw those changes because we all demanded them. And if we don't do it, things might get fearfully worse. This is my last slide. This comes from The Economist, not a publication noted for its progressive values or socialist tendencies. But they responded to a challenge on Twitter. Somebody said, what factors most predictive of Donald Trump's success? What this chart is showing is the swing to Republicans over Democrats. So it's the swing to Trump in US counties. And the factor that they found best predicted that swing to Donald Trump was an index of population health that included obesity, diabetes, heavy drinking, physical exercise or lack thereof, and life expectancy. So it was in the counties with the worst health, in the counties most affected by inequality, in the counties where people are despairing because they've been left behind and their incomes haven't caught up, that's where we see the swing to Donald Trump. So the risk of doing nothing about inequality is that we leave a vacuum which other people will be happy to fill. So please, take away from this weekend some courage, some cheerfulness, but some real positive attitude to actually do something. Small, large, together, alone. Let's just keep cracking on.
Doing my Phil Donahue, running through the room.
Thank you very much. I have a question about the lifestyle drift. That's something I haven't heard of that term before, but in my field, which is industrial and labor relations, for many years we've been bemoaning the incursion of a very psychological, individual level kind of scholarship. So IO psychology, organizational behavior that really focuses on the micro level and the individual decisions, and a real hollowing out of the spaces in the academy for some of this more macro level scholarship, if you will. And I'm just wondering if you see that as kind of a trend, or if you see that in other places.
Well, in my own discipline, which is public health and epidemiology, we know that that's not a good idea. We know that it's the broader social determinants that matter the most, but we're unable to get that across. And you can still have a decent academic career studying smoking cessation programs and all of those individual behavioral interventions. I think my sense is that some disciplines are shifting towards a more social view, actually, rather than the other way. So I think economics is becoming more imbued with a sense of the social than it ever was, and God knows it needs more. Psychology as well. So a lot of the most interesting recent research on the impact of inequality is coming out of psychology, social psychological work. And even a lot of the work in neurology, brain and behavior is focused on the social. So people have now shown that in an experimental situation, if you make somebody feel excluded and left out, it hurts in the same area of the brain as if you hit them physically. So we feel social pain in the same way we feel physical pain. And you can reduce social pain by giving people Tylenol, obviously only temporarily. But this attention to the social, I think, is coming through quite strongly in some disciplines. So I'm interested by what you said, because it sounds like it's just going the other way in yours.
So first of all, thank you. I've been following the Spirit Level since it first came out, and it's one of the few things that's kind of given me some hope. But what didn't give me hope was watching Donald Trump's person talking about the cutting back on Meals on Wheels. And so what I want to ask you is this, because it goes to the core of what we are now facing. As you said, maybe the Reaganites and the Thatcherites really believed it, but they cannot believe it now. So I saw this man say that, well, we have to change our focus from, the person who's receiving it to the person we're taking it from, and he lied because he characterized it as a single parent with a kid in Des Moines when we really know that tax cuts are for the wealthy, and nobody asked him, when you focus from the person who's receiving the money to who you are lying that's giving the money, what happens to the person that you're not giving the money to? They die. So two new words have come up that I've seen lately, which is exterminism and democide. So this isn't accidental. It isn't something that's just kind of happened. How, in heaven's name, do we actually fight back against what is so deliberately malicious and intended to kill people? That's my question, because it's all true, but we're missing the bit of how are we fighting back against that kind of attitude and that deliberate strategy of murder? That's my... I am known for doom and gloom.
It's extremely difficult. So, leading up to the Brexit vote in the UK last year, we had a government minister say publicly, the British public have had enough of experts. We don't want your facts. We keep hearing about alternative facts and fake news. And so in this climate, how do you fight that, because you've got expertise and evidence, if people are just going to dismiss it? They always have dismissed it a bit, but they didn't used to be so rude about it. So people, if you went to government and you showed them some stuff on health inequalities, they would nod and go, it's a terrible problem, we're going to do something about it, and then not do it. But now we're in a world where they say, I don't believe your facts. I've got my own. I really struggle, and this change feels so new that I'm still grappling with it. I do think at the moment what is hugely critical is a free press that is resourced to do critical and investigative journalism. At the moment, that feels like it's the only thing standing between us and some chaos. But we really need the solidarity. Vandana was telling me earlier about a meeting she had been to in Germany that tried to get the church and the unions and who else was it? And the environmental activists to work together. And I do think it's those sorts of coalitions that we need. We've had, in the UK, this terrible climate of labelling poor people as shirkers and contrasting them with the strivers. And it's been in the media, in the tabloid press, and a group of churches got together and produced a very powerful report debunking that. So when we work together, we can overcome it, but I don't know, this feels like a very frightening time to me, where everything that we might have thought we could bring to bear can be dismissed. No, it's a really good point. I've just become a subscriber to The Guardian, which means, I'm paying them some money because I desperately need to keep that newspaper and that online website afloat. So I think we could all do this. New Internationalist, which does a lot of great journalism, is currently opening up a crowd sourcing effort to try and raise money to keep itself afloat. We need to step up a bit and do everything we can to support the ability of our press to keep drawing our attention to these matters. And they're going to face more and more hostility, I suspect, in the years to come, so they will need our backing.
Thank you, Professor Pickett, for a superbly depressing indictment of the uncoupling of evidence from action. The mention of Donald Trump, there's a course of melancholy and merriment runs through the room at that moment, and it often tends to tempt us to give our own localities a pass, to just look to the States as the most egregious example. Canada has survived 10 years of Harper government and an onslaught on evidence in this country. One of our most chronic symptoms of inequality and its outcomes are the condition of Indigenous peoples in this country. We've had a process called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and at the end of that, there's a very interesting phenomenon in which we go as far as the affect, but not as far as the economic outcome. That is to say, we are all in favor of reconciliation without economic redistribution. Now, behind that seems to be a convergence that not only is neoliberal economics a driver of this, but that there is racism too. That is that particular kinds of social toxin seem to join hands in a more invigorated assault on justice. Do you find in your work the kinds of convergence between other kinds of inequity and the economic inequity that is at the heart of the notion of economic inequality?
Yes, absolutely. So we see greater gender equality in societies that are more economically equal. The rights of migrants and ethnic and religious minorities or language minorities tend to get trampled on in more unequal societies. Any marker, anything that becomes a marker of low social status for whatever reason is going to attract more discrimination, more downward prejudice in a society that is more hierarchical, because status differences matter more. So gender, race, religion, abilities, all are sort of interwoven. All those what I think of as sort of horizontal inequalities get made much, much more worse when the weight of the downward prejudice is greater in a more hierarchical society. I was struck by what you said about Canada. I remember reading some statistic from a Canadian survey that showed an astonishingly high proportion of academics here felt that they didn't have the freedom to necessarily say or do what they wanted or do the research that they wanted to do. I was quite shocked by that, and I consider myself really lucky because my university, it always backs me up whenever anybody rings up the dean and says I've been naughty, you know.
Yeah.
I'd have stood up sooner. I think that there is a major factor promoting inequality that you haven't taken into consideration, and that's the dynamics of our money system. The dynamics of our money system. If I can take a couple of minutes, I can get started on showing how this is at work. 97% of the money that's in circulation that we depend on for our economic transactions is created out of nothing by private banks in their normal process of making loans. Now, the kicker here is that the banks create the principal of the loans that they make, but they don't create the interest that they require to be paid. People who owe money have to go out and compete with each other to get enough money to pay that's been created as principal only to pay back both principal and interest. And this is an impossibility. People borrow more and more and more and get more and more and more into debt. And as we're all conscious of that. And eventually there's a recession, and those who are more vulnerable economically lose out. And with each economic recession, with the business cycle, which is really not necessary, but economists say is inevitable, there's more inequality that results. And the answer to this has to be for ordinary people through our governments to gain control over the power to create money out of nothing. We've turned that over to the private banks. We've got to get it back. And we can do this in Canada through our publicly owned Bank of Canada. And the income can be, inequality can be overcome through public support for public programs, instead of our spending $50 to $60 billion a year on paying interest to private banks.
Good point. I am all in favour of doing something about not just a democratisation of our financial sector, but a reduction in that sector too, because it is the massive growth of the financial sector has driven inequality. There's a fabulous new book out by a woman called Anne Pettifer, an economist in Britain, which is about how to create alternatives to the banks. And we do have the power to do it. I do think it is an important part of what we need to do.
I want to come back to that particular graph, also connected to the last question about the issue of convergence of inequality, creating mechanisms, bringing in race and other things. Not only were the voters for the Trump phenomena, having that particular characteristic, but they were made to believe here was the savior. And I think we're going to see, and this is what we need to be prepared for, that the worst victims of an unequal society will be mobilized to support further inequality. I know there's a contribution, I don't know if it happened, on the death of a Dalit, which was, an Indian student from a Dalit group, was tortured because he was part of a progressive group in campus, screening a film on communal rights, the killings of Muslims and Hindus. And he was removed, but he could only survive on a scholarship. His family was supported by a scholarship. Eventually, he committed suicide. At that point, the entire university was shut down. Any university that protested against the suicide was, the right-wing students came very much like the stormtroopers of Hitler. But the fascinating thing is, in the recent elections, the same government that killed Rohit came out as the savior of the Dalits, and they voted. And that is the prevention, which is why solidarity for me becomes the place where we prevent this from happening in country after country. And I want to thank you so much, Kate.
Well, thank you, Vandana, for all the work you do. I'm sorry I missed your talk last night. Yeah, you're absolutely right that the people suffering the most are being promised things that they will not be delivered. If Trump had got his way with his healthcare bill yesterday, there would be, I think, was it 24 million more people without health insurance? And it would be these people. It would be these people. In the UK, ahead of the Brexit vote, the public was told that there would be £350 million a week to spend on the NHS if we left. And it's a lie. But it was on the side of buses and they drove around. And people believed it. So one thing we need to do is we need somehow to think about how we create a society where people can spot that they're being lied to. And in an unequal society, education suffers, children do less well, they are less equipped to understand the damage that inequality is doing to them because they're growing up in a more unequal society. So we all have a duty to teach. And we absolutely have a duty to not dismiss these people as idiots because they voted for Donald Trump, or stupid because they voted for Brexit, thinking it would stop migration from non-EU countries. We can't think of them that way. We have to understand where they're coming from, what their lives are like, what has been happening to their communities over decades, why they're angry, why they're ready to believe the promises of somebody who manages to connect with them. And we, the liberal elite, share a weight of responsibility here. And we do need to think about the ways we create solidarity with those who are suffering, even when they are across the political divide from us. Yeah.
I think we could continue here for a long time and continue this really wonderful conversation, but we have to move on to the next session, which very appropriately is about strategizing for action. I would like to say thank you to Kate for a really wonderful presentation and to thank her for using